The love of my life became the deepest betrayal I could ever know. That night in Vegas marked the beginning of a nightmare. Her touch, once so familiar, now felt like poison. I saw them together, their stolen moments slicing through my heart like a knife. Each glance, each whisper, destroyed what was left of our vows. The pain consumed me, but it was the fury that kept me standing. She wasn't just my wife anymore. She was my biggest mistake. Walking away was my only salvation, or I'd lose more than just my soul. I was really happy for Ron. After seeing him so sad for so long, it was nice that he had found someone who truly cared for him. They looked great together whenever Cal and I saw them in town, especially when they danced at Fisher's. Ron had clearly been taking some dance lessons, which surprised me since I didn't know how he found the time. They moved around the dance floor smoothly, holding each other close and focused on one another. It was clear they were in love, and I had mixed feelings about it. I had been Sherry's best friend since high school, while Ron was a newer friend. But he seemed so happy, and I couldn't fault him for that. Karen was beautiful, and Ron didn't realize how handsome he was. There were women at the club who would have dropped everything for Ron if he had just smiled at them. But he wouldn't ever do that. I knew him too well. It was clear that they were a perfect match. Now that Ron moved to Denver, he emails me about once a week, always cheerful and asking about the new baby. I never told him that I thought Cal had gotten me pregnant that night at Fisher's, but I think he has a hint. I mentioned the situation, and he's smart enough to understand. When Calvin Jr. was born 6 months after Ron left, I'm not sure Ron realized that the R in Cal's middle name stood for Ronald. Knowing Ron, it wouldn't even cross his mind that we named our baby in honor of his friendship. Anyway, after her divorce, things were really tough for Sherry for a long time. She lost her job because news of her divorce spread at the office. Many people thought they could help her feel better, even though she pushed them away, embarrassing some of them in the process. They still kept trying to reach out. Her new job paid less, making it hard for her to keep up with all the bills. She finally found the nice 2-bedroom apartment she wanted, but it cost more than she could really afford, and she needed to buy a lot of new clothes, too. Once she sold the house that she and Ron had shared, things got a bit better, but soon she was spending for 2 new people in her life, and I'm not sure I fully understood that. I didn't agree with her decisions for a long time. I mean, those 2 roommates, as she called them, didn't scare me away. Oops. I said I wasn't going to get into that, didn't I? Enough about that. It took almost a year after their divorce for me to feel comfortable with Sherry again. She called me every week during that time, and she always ended the call by apologizing for what happened in Vegas. She felt sorry. Sometimes, saying sorry doesn't fix everything, you know? That's what I thought. But after a while, it was clear that Sherry was really struggling. She felt embarrassed about what had happened in Vegas and was even more scared to face her ex-husband when she got back home. On top of that, she was sad about the pain she had caused him. She couldn't talk to me for even a minute without getting upset, filled with guilt for breaking his trust and love. She told me she felt guilty then, but got swept up in excitement. She described it like butterflies in her stomach, just like when she sneaked out to see her first serious boyfriend. She thought it made her feel alive and young again. I didn't quite understand that part, especially since I had turned 30 just a year before, and Sherry was almost 32. I wasn't sure I believed her need to feel young again. Guess what? I didn't know this until Sherry and I started our Saturday morning coffee chats again. It was about time, let me tell you. I'd been upset with her for quite a while. One morning, she told me that she had gone to Fisher's one night alone and saw Ron there with Karen. It was just before he moved away to Denver. She had gone out to enjoy a nice dinner but ended up watching them dance while trying to eat a cold steak. Sherry said that was when she really felt the weight of her choices toward Ron. She hadn't fully understood what he went through, what he felt, until she saw him with that woman, as she called Karen. It hurt her to see Ron with someone else. She said it felt like a sharp pain inside her. I told her Ron had every right to move on. I might have sounded a bit too harsh. I said he was allowed to see Karen, and Sherry agreed that she knew that. They had been divorced for over a month by then, but it still hurt her deeply. She shared all this with me to help me see that she finally understood how she had treated the man who loved her. I told her it was about time. Surprisingly, she didn't get mad. Instead, she was really upset with herself. She wanted to find a way to make it right, but didn't know how because she had so many responsibilities. Well, Sherry and I worked through that hard time and became closer. I suggested she talk to a counselor or a minister. When she was financially stable again, she went to see a counselor, and she started to feel better over time. She never fully forgot her past choices, but learned to accept them without letting them take over her life. If she hadn't done that, I think it might have really affected her mental health. She felt really bad about everything. Now she visits frequently, and we chat about all sorts of things, just like we used to. My boys think their Aunt Sherry is fantastic, and they run to greet her whenever she arrives. She hugs them tightly and loves spending time with them until they're laughing and having a good time. Cal took a while to warm up to Sherry again. For a long time, he would quietly stay away when she came over. But with what I told him about my talks with Sherry and what he saw himself, he slowly started to open up. Sherry would occasionally bring her two friends along, and Cal got along well with them right away. After some time, the house felt a bit empty when they weren't around. But I plan to change that. Cal and I are going out for dinner tonight, and we're hoping to make our home lively and full of people, even if it means I have to look after the kids. I'm hoping for a girl this time. The first 3 years in Denver were busy and exciting. I was working hard and spending long hours at the office. It was the usual routine. Whenever the big bosses saw I could handle my work, they piled on more tasks to test my limits. They hadn't reached my breaking point yet, but they were getting close. Karen and I were still going strong, and I was thinking about proposing to her, but she never mentioned it, and I often wondered why. Then things got more complicated in Afghanistan. Our company had gotten several contracts to help rebuild the country. In one of these, we were coordinating resources and giving out smaller contracts to other firms to handle different tasks, similar to what larger companies were doing elsewhere. We were working on a contract to build a significant highway from Kabul to Faizabad and up to the border with Tajikistan. The road was mainly for military use initially, but the new Afghan government hoped it would eventually promote trade between the two countries. It was a risky situation because some groups still posed a threat nearby. They occasionally crossed the border, causing disruptions before retreating to safer areas. Such events didn't happen often, and when they did, it was usually just one side involved, with fewer people willing to participate over time. One group, however, managed to sneak into the country and targeted an important bridge over a deep gorge. This action blocked the road between our team working on a new road and the supply centers at the back. They also harmed several small towns and villages nearby, affecting schools for children of all ages, community centers, a few small radio stations, and a television site. The workers on the ground called for help, so our company had to partner with another small business to ensure our main project could finish on time. It was crucial for our future as a company. 72 hours later, young Mr. Ron Masters was on a flight to Kabul to oversee the teamwork of both groups now working on the same project. They were glad to avoid any confusion about leadership and sharing tasks. Before I left, I needed to talk to Karen. I would be away for a long time, and some questions between us needed answers. I had to know if we were a couple and what that meant for us. "Honey, have you ever thought about getting married?" I asked as I watched her prepare a salad in her kitchen the day before my trip. While chopping, her knife accidentally hit the side of the sink. She looked at me surprised. I quickly moved over and checked her hand to see if she was hurt. "Sorry," I said. "I thought you might have cut yourself." "I almost did," she replied, the color returning to her cheeks as I sat back down at the breakfast bar. "Well, have you?" I asked. She leaned against the counter looking at me with curiosity. "Have you?" she responded, but it didn't really answer my question. I nodded anyway. "Yeah, I have," I replied. "But I'm not sure what you think about it. Sometimes it seems like you enjoy our independence, and everything that comes with it." "What else?" she asked. "I wonder if the way we live now is what you like best. We see each other for a few days each month, and it's fun, but you're in Sacramento, and I'm in Denver. I sometimes think maybe distance makes us appreciate each other more. Getting married would be a big step, and I'm not sure if you'd want me around all the time." I had thought about this topic for a long time. I think I caught Karen off guard. We had grown comfortable with each other and hadn't had any disagreements for a while. No, she said. It's not what you think, sweetie. She paused, then came over to me and put her arms around my neck. Ronnie, she said slowly when we had a quiet moment, the reason I haven't talked about this is a bit different than what you believe. She took a deep breath, staying close. I love you, Ron, that's clear. And I know you love me too, she said gently. The only thing bothering us is that you keep part of yourself from me, and I don't think you even realize it. If that wasn't the case, I'd leave my job right now and come live with you forever. I was shocked. What was it that I was keeping from her? We ended up talking for hours. I never quite understood what she thought I was hiding. It seemed to have to do with the idea that I hadn't really moved on from Sherry, that I still had feelings for her. I thought I was just holding on to a lot of anger from my past. That felt more like what I was experiencing. I grew a bit impatient with Karen. I didn't believe there were any good feelings left for my ex-wife, and I told Karen so. She insisted, though, and wouldn't change her mind. We decided to end the conversation after dinner to avoid turning it into a big argument. Neither of us wanted that, especially with only a day left before I had to leave for Afghanistan. Life was too short. Later that night, we shared a quiet closeness and then lay exhausted in each other's arms. Ronnie, she said just before we fell asleep, let's really think about our future while you're away, okay? Then when you come back, we can go somewhere alone, for a while, and figure things out, okay, darling? Okay, it's a plan, I said softly. She didn't say more. After a moment, she turned away from me and we settled into a comfortable position. My arms were around her. We slept peacefully and woke up early. Eventually, it was time for me to leave. When I returned to Denver, I had about 6 hours before my flight to JFK Airport in New York. From there, I'd take multiple flights heading east to Europe and then to Asia, slowly making my way to Kabul. There weren't many airlines serving that troubled country, and my company required its workers to use American Airlines whenever they could. This made the travel plans a bit trickier. After doing a load of laundry and packing everything I might need in Afghanistan, I had 2 hours left with not much to do before heading to the airport. Thinking about my talk with Karen, I searched through the back of my closet until I found the box with all the papers from my divorce. At the bottom, tucked among the documents, was a packet of pictures I had taken of my wife and another man. Next to them was the small ring box that had held Sherry's engagement and wedding rings. She sent everything back to me through her lawyer the day after our divorce was official. I thought the items belonged to her, but returning them was her way of closing that chapter in our lives. I looked at the pictures one by one. They didn't appeal to me, but I didn't feel strong anger or bitterness anymore. They seemed like snapshots of strangers rather than people I once knew. I realized I didn't want these memories sitting around, especially if something were to happen to me in Afghanistan and someone needed to sort through my things. So I quickly gathered everything else back into the box and shut it tightly, leaving out the photos. Then I used my shredder. In moments, those images turned into tiny bits of paper, and I moved on without a second thought. Afghanistan in late winter is tough. It's often very cold and the weather can be snowy or windy, sometimes both at once. Nice days are rare. This part of the country is especially dry and lifeless. I couldn't understand why anyone would choose to live there, but Afghanistan has been home to people for a very long time. I just shook my head. The days were long and the work was hard, even without the worry of attacks. Working with big machines is risky, but we had a solid safety program and followed the rules closely. For safety, we had a group of Marines led by a young lieutenant, but their presence didn't guarantee we were safe. After a month, I talked the senior sergeant into letting me borrow an M4, a carbine version of the M16. The last person who used it had gone home for an emergency and hadn't returned yet. It was still logged in, and I was just looking after it. Having the M4 made me feel safer. I had always been good with guns. Back home, I could easily hit a deer from 200 yards away with my Remington Model 700. The M4 felt right in my hands. By my 3rd month, we were close to finishing the bridge repairs. We laid new bases where needed and replaced sections that had been damaged. At the same time, we set up a plan to keep supplies coming for the team working on the road to the north. We used helicopters for urgent deliveries and built a dirt road around the gorge for other supplies. It worked, but it was slow, so the crew up north had to plan their needs well ahead of time. Conditions were getting better every day. Our project was on track. The road would be finished on or before schedule, and the Army even gave us a smaller contract that looked promising. We were working hard, but in the quiet surroundings, we often put in long hours just to keep busy. Melissa's diary. When I found out that Ron was going to Afghanistan, I felt really anxious. Ron felt like family to me, and I worried about him. When I told Sherry, her face showed how shocked she was. She seemed really overwhelmed. I was surprised because she and Ron had been divorced for almost 3 years and had been living apart even longer after their separation. It's been a while since I wrote in my diary. If I say something more than once, I can always fix it later when I read it again as I get older. Let me think. Where was I? Recently, I tried to help Sherry be nicer to herself. She had been feeling down, blaming herself for past issues, which was affecting how she felt. After going to counseling a second time, she started to feel better. She worked through her feelings with the counselor and learned ways to improve her situation. She has been doing much better since then. When I told her about Ron's trip, she seemed shocked at first. But after we started getting regular emails from him, she relaxed a bit. The emails did not come often because communication was limited, but they were enough to reassure us. He wrote about how tough his job was, but it was also a bit boring. There wasn't much to do aside from work. On the bright side, he mentioned that he became very fit, which made him happy. He sent a photo with one of his emails where he looked healthy and strong. Sherry asked me to print it in a larger size for her, and she kept a few smaller copies too. Around this time, I noticed Sherry hadn't been dating anyone. When I asked her about it, I felt awkward to find out she hadn't gone on any dates since her split with Ron, something I completely missed. So, Cal and I began to take Sherry out for dinner and dancing from time to time. At the dances, she liked to dance fast with some of the guys, but she was very picky. Some men faced rejection, and a few left looking a bit embarrassed if they tried too hard. Cal said he admired how well Sherry spoke, and it seemed to impress him. She only danced slow dances with him and a few older men she trusted, and she kept her drinks to 1 or 2 glasses of white wine for the night. It was clear to me that she was waiting for something. One day, I encouraged her to share what was on her mind. After spending some time under the pecan tree in my backyard with good food and friendly chats, she opened up. She shared that she felt Ron might come back to town one day. If that happened, she hoped he would see that she hadn't been with anyone else and might forgive her for past mistakes. She was willing to wait as long as needed for him to see how much she had changed, ready to face whatever came next. Even though she hoped to rebuild their relationship, she also understood that they might not get back together. It felt like a time of atonement for Sherry as she waited for Ron to come back and recognize her changes. Sherry did not know when he would return. She just believed that he would. I suggested some fun ways to encourage him to come back, but she was firm about not wanting to pressure him. I worried that this might mean a long wait, but she shook her head. Sure, he would eventually come back to town. I decided to drop the topic. I even tried to introduce her to some nice guys from Cal's work, but she never seemed interested in dating anyone. While I wasn't entirely happy with the situation, she appeared content. Accepting her choice was tough for me. After attending her counseling sessions, Sherry slowly regained her confidence and well-being. She had gone through a lot, but now she seemed healthy and full of life. I admired her, even if it was a bit hard for me. With 3 children of my own, I felt a small twinge of envy at how great she looked. Sherry seemed focused and happier than she had in a long time. She got involved with the local PTA and took part in the neighborhood watch program. Her life felt lively again, thanks in part to her roommates who kept her spirits up. Sherry was also doing well at work. After starting a new job at an accounting firm following her divorce, she quickly moved up in rank. Managing a team of 16 auditors and financial analysts, she was on her way to an even better position when the current supervisor stepped down. She truly enjoyed her work. She often joined us for barbecues, fitting right into our extended family. Our oldest boy, now 5, had a recent birthday celebration, while our 3-year-old, Cal Jr., admired her as if she were family. Our youngest, just 14 months, followed Sherry around with sweet enthusiasm. It was heartwarming to watch her attempt to walk toward Sherry, occasionally stumbling but always determined, laughing happily when she reached her. Sherry brought so much joy to our children. We were waiting for Ron's email any day now. It had been about a week since we last heard from him, and he usually made an effort to reach out to Cal and me about once a week. I showed all the emails to Sherry. She often asked for the latest one if I hadn't passed it on to her right away. I sometimes wondered what Ron would think if he knew. I learned that Afghanistan in early spring isn't the most pleasant place. Instead of blowing snow, there was blowing dust, and I couldn't tell which was worse. Both had serious downsides. I think I'm starting to like snow more. At least it melts away. Dust and sand just settle into small spaces and cause problems. A quarter of our machines, like bulldozers and dump trucks, were out of order each day because dirt blocked important parts. This was especially annoying since most of our equipment was built to handle dusty conditions. I began to wonder if someone was trying to sabotage us. 2 weeks after I first thought this, Marine Lance Corporal Arvin Cantwell and I caught one of the workers messing with an air filter that should not have been touched. We didn't like hiring these workers because we couldn't check their backgrounds. We had no way of knowing if they were sent by the local leader or if they just showed up. The person we caught could have had connections we didn't know about. The dirt and small stones we found in the air filter showed he might be involved with a group. We reported him to some Afghan National Guard soldiers who took him away, and we never saw him again. After that, we became more aware of our surroundings, and our machines started working better. But other problems continued. With about 40 days left to finish, we put strict security steps in place for our vehicles. We parked them far from the main camp for locals and workers. Then Lieutenant Fredericks set up night watch duties around them, with my team helping out. Although my team didn't have weapons, they could raise the alarm if they saw something odd, which meant help could be sent quickly. Everyone among our contractor team was worried that something might happen soon. Once the road was cleared to the border, any trouble would probably be easy to sort out. We felt uneasy. I also need to talk to Melissa. I found out she's been passing my emails to my ex-wife, Sherry. When I last spoke to Karen, she mentioned Sherry, saying it was a worry for our relationship. Karen thought I hadn't fully moved on from Sherry and that she would always be a concern for us. I thought that idea was silly, but I held back from saying so. I know women can be sensitive, so I kept my thoughts to myself. On top of that, Melissa was sharing personal details about me with Sherry. It bothered me when Melissa said Sherry was worried about me. In a way, this seemed to back up Karen's worries. It felt like Sherry was still somehow in my life even after our divorce over 3 years ago. I wasn't happy to hear from Melissa that Sherry wasn't seeing anyone because of how she felt about her past treatment of me. But last night, I remembered some good times, like the first day I walked into a small cafe near campus. I was busy studying mechanical engineering, going to classes during the day and working at night to make a living. Sherry was the waitress there, and she welcomed me with a warm smile when I sat down. I felt an instant connection with her even before I looked at the menu. I had other dreams, but that one stuck with me. A week later, while I was in line for lunch, I noticed a young man from Afghanistan. He caught my eye because he appeared out of nowhere between 2 large trucks. I hadn't seen anyone around when I walked by, so his sudden presence surprised me. The more I watched him, the more uneasy I felt. He looked curious and scanned the area. I set my cup down on the hood of one of the marine vehicles and adjusted my gear, readying myself just in case something unexpected happened. It was important to stay prepared. Lance Corporal Myers was with me by the front of the vehicle, eating his meal beside mine. Not many of us liked to sit while eating. We preferred to stay aware of what was happening around us. The vehicle's hood was a practical spot for our food. Over the past couple of months, I had become close friends with Billy Myers, one of the squad leaders. We often joined in the group's casual target shooting practice. Every morning, I checked and loaded a magazine for my rifle, following the routine like the other Marines. This morning I had pulled the charging handle to prepare my weapon, but now I pressed the bolt catch to load a round. I continued watching the young man as I clicked the safety off. I kept my finger near the receiver, not on the trigger, making sure I wouldn't fire by mistake. It's unwise to place a finger on the trigger if you're not ready to shoot. "Sir, Mr. Masters, what's wrong?" Billy Myers asked, glancing at me when he heard the sound of my weapon being readied. "I'm not sure," I replied, keeping my eyes on the young man across from us. He had an odd look on his face that seemed both serious and anxious. Suddenly, I felt something wasn't right. This young man looked unusually heavy in a place where food was scarce. The only people I usually saw who were overweight were older men in positions of power. Their size showed their wealth and status, and this young man didn't seem to fit that type. "Something feels off," I whispered. The young man was reaching under his loose clothes and finally pulled something from the front of his shirt. He quickly headed toward a big group of Marines and construction workers gathered around the large soup pots, waiting for more food. I opened my hand, and my cup of coffee fell to the ground. "No!" I shouted. The man turned and looked at me. A strong wind blew against him, revealing large, suspicious shapes taped around his upper body and waist. He turned and tried to run towards the group of people. I raised my M4 rifle and aimed. There were many people around, but I felt I had to act. My instincts pushed me. I pulled the trigger, and there was a flash as he dropped to the ground. "Boots and saddles! Boots and saddles!" Corporal Myers shouted into his radio. The young privates had heard it in an old movie and used it as a quick warning. The lieutenant didn't like it much, but knew it was important. Then there were more shots. The noise came from behind me. Billy and I turned to see a line of armed men running towards our camp. More were climbing up from a ravine we hadn't seen before. The lance corporal and I both crouched down and started firing. The M4 can shoot one bullet at a time or three at once. I kept it on the single-shot setting. More Marines joined in. I heard the lieutenant directing a squad to help with covering fire against the attackers. Seconds later, they opened fire, and the number of attackers started to fall. I changed my empty magazine for a new one, making sure it was secure. I heard a strange noise and looked to my left. An older man with a black turban was running towards me, shouting and clearly upset. More importantly, he was firing a pistol at us. Billy was focused on the attackers from the ravine, so I had to take action. I turned around quickly and started to fire back. I switched to automatic and began shooting bursts. The attacker fell to the ground, no longer aiming at us. Most of what happened next was told to me later. In that moment, as I shot, I felt a pain in my left shoulder. I was caught off guard while trying to move towards the shelter of the Humvee. I twisted my ankle in a hole and in the chaos bumped my head against the Humvee. Melissa's diary. "Ronnie has been hurt. They say he's been shot, but I can't get anyone to tell me how serious it is. I feel like I could scream if I don't find out soon. I didn't know it, but Ron listed me and Cal along with that Karen person to be notified if he got hurt. Ron didn't have much family left, just a couple of second cousins. His sister had passed away a few years ago in a car accident. So when he decided to make a big choice, I think he felt it was the only option. When he gets home, I plan to give him a big hug for thinking about us. After that, I need to have a serious conversation with him about what he decided to do." Surprisingly, Sherry took the news pretty well. I was shocked at how calm she was about it. She had been really upset when Ron first mentioned going to that country. Now she was soothing me, saying he would be okay. She talked about how he would return one day and nothing could stop that. She told me just the other day that it was only a matter of time. I hope she's right. Ron hasn't even met my two young kids. They were born after he moved to Denver, and I really want them to know him. I just hope he's safe. I woke up in a hospital run by the Army, located on the outskirts of Kabul. My head hurt more than anything I had ever experienced before. When I tried to move, a sharp pain shot through my shoulder. Everything around me went dark for a moment before I started to see again. Lying still, I lifted my head a little off the pillow and tried to look around. I noticed a needle in my right arm, connected to a bag of blood hanging nearby. There were other bottles up there too, but I couldn't tell what was in them. Turning my head slightly, I could see that my shoulder was covered in bandages. A small move of my fingers confirmed that whatever was under the bandage was causing the pain that made me feel so faint. A woman in hospital scrubs entered the room. She took one look at me and quickly left to get help from down a hallway. Soon, a man and another woman came in and gathered around my bed. "How are you feeling?" the man asked in a deep voice. I noticed the silver emblem on his shirt, so I figured he was a doctor. "My shoulder really hurts," I managed to say, struggling to get the words out. I rubbed my throat and mimed drinking. The doctor nodded and signaled to the first woman to pour water from a pitcher. She brought a straw to my mouth so I could drink. "Thank you," I said, my voice a bit clearer now. "Where am I?" I asked, looking at the group of medical staff. "Kabul," the doctor replied. He then shone a small light in my eyes, moving it back and forth. He grunted and put the flashlight away. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly, catching me off guard. "Ronald Terrence Masters," I answered. And you? He was starting to get on my nerves. Dr. Evans, he replied briefly, though a small smile appeared as he said it. Do you remember what happened to you? He continued, sounding more friendly. I nodded slowly, trying not to move my shoulder too much. We were ambushed, I said carefully. There was an explosion, and then people attacked from behind, and an older man had a weapon. I paused with nothing more to add. I don't remember anything after that, I admitted. The doctor nodded, looking satisfied. From what they say, he started casually, you hit something and lost consciousness, but you should be fine. Your head doesn't seem broken, just a mild concussion. Your memory seems mostly okay, and your pupils are reacting normally, so it looks like the head injury isn't your biggest problem. I agreed with his assessment. I felt the same as before the incident, except for a headache that was getting better. And I don't think your shoulder will be a big issue either, he added confidently. It was easy for him to say since he wasn't feeling any pain. Ugh! I groaned when I tried to move. The younger one, whom I thought was a nurse, wiped the sweat that had suddenly appeared on my forehead. We can give you something for the pain, the doctor said, jotting down notes on some papers clipped at the end of my bed. He turned to leave, taking the older woman with him, talking quickly to her in words I didn't really understand. The young nurse, a first lieutenant, stayed behind to cool my forehead with a cloth. When I asked, she helped me raise my upper body, which made me much more comfortable than lying flat. When the older woman returned, she gave me some medicine through the IV in my right arm. Soon after, the pain eased a lot, and I drifted back to sleep. 2 weeks later, I was called ambulatory, which was a term the Army medical staff used, and I felt restless. My shoulder was healing well, and they had started guiding me through some gentle movements to help me recover. I found a computer terminal and checked my email, sending messages to Karen and Melissa to let them know I was okay. My inbox had many messages from both women and, surprisingly, several from co-workers back at the office. I emailed my boss and secretary in Denver, asking them to share that I was fine and getting better. I mentioned that I was currently using only my right arm, and typing with one hand took a while. I tried to answer all the emails I could, but it took some time. Yesterday, the Marine platoon visited me. They had returned to base for some rest before heading out on their next mission. I didn't really know what was happening when a young nurse brought me to the hospital's day room. A few minutes later, the double doors swung open, and all 46 Marines walked in. They lined up around 3 sides of the room and faced me while standing tall. The lieutenant in charge stepped forward and saluted. I later found out that 2 officers beside him were his company and battalion leaders. The nurse helped me stand up. I felt a little out of place in my worn hospital pajamas and robe, but no one seemed to mind. The lieutenant called the group to attention and then asked them to salute me, which was unusual because military people usually don't salute civilians. After he relaxed his men, the lieutenant read a heartfelt message from a piece of paper that looked like old parchment. Then they gave me a large, round piece of metal from the bottom of an artillery shell, polished to a nice brown color. According to the message, it represented a bronze star for bravery during an event at kilometer 137. It said that my quick thinking had saved many Marines and civilian workers. I felt my face warm up, and I was so touched that I struggled to speak. Finally, I managed to thank the officers and the men. I asked if I could shake hands with everyone in the platoon and moved to the door. As they walked out, I shook every hand and stepped outside to share one last moment with them. The next morning, I was on a military med-evac flight to Landstuhl, Germany, where I stayed for several days before flying home. I knew the company was paying the government for my medical care, but I felt that everyone had done so much for me. Wherever I went, Marines stopped to talk to me, always mentioning my bronze star. I was surprised that complete strangers knew my name and the details of what had happened to me. It was eye-opening to see how quickly word travels among military personnel. I admired the teamwork of those brave Marines and wondered if I might have chosen a different path in life, but it felt too late to change now. It was time to return to what I do best. My vacation in Afghanistan, exciting as it was, had come to an end. My office in the Denver corporate complex was waiting for me. It looked just the same as it had 6 months ago, although there was a bit of a musty smell. My relationship with Karen didn't make it through the long time apart. It wasn't because she was seeing someone else. She actually felt quite lonely. She had hoped I would come back and help us heal before sharing some tough news. We disagreed about whether there was still a connection between us. I sensed something was bothering her, but she wouldn't say what it was. I tried to keep my frustration in check to avoid making our farewell harder than it needed to be. Even though I didn't share her views, I accepted that she felt strongly about them. I knew she had a point about our breakup, but her reasoning was not entirely right. We had a long history together, and while I considered proposing to her, I never went through with it. We ended things as peacefully as we could, given the situation. The change in my life became clear soon after we parted. Just 2 weeks later, I found myself enjoying time with a coworker from another floor. It was a light and fun connection that I appreciated. 2 months after my return, I overheard a chat between two coworkers. One was an executive assistant, and the other was a manager in HR. They mentioned that my name was being considered for a new position that the CEO was about to announce. I hadn't seen that coming and realized that sometimes people forget where they are when they talk. A week later, I got the official news. I was being promoted back to my old role, this time as Executive Vice President. I was intrigued by the opportunity. It felt promising, especially since my current role was reaching its limit without waiting a long time for higher positions to open. After thinking about it for a couple of days, I decided to accept the offer. 4 years after my divorce, I was heading home. "Hey, is anyone home?" I stood at Melissa and Cal's front door, knocking loudly enough to make the windows shake, with a big smile on my face. I hadn't seen my friends in a long time, and I was excited to catch up. I heard some movement behind the closed door before it swung open. "Ron!" At first, I couldn't tell if Melissa was happy to see me or not. She paused for a moment, then stepped forward and hugged me tightly. She started to cry on my shoulder. I patted her back and reassured her that everything would be all right. After a bit, she pulled back and looked at me. "Why didn't you tell us you were coming?" she asked, playfully hitting my chest. I pretended to stumble back, which made her smile at me. She took my arm and guided me into the cool house. "Cal!" she shouted. "Come here! It's Ron!" I knew Cal could hear her from far away, and he came rushing into the living room a moment later. We greeted each other warmly, shaking hands and giving friendly pats on the back until he noticed how cheerful we were being. I reassured him that everything was fine. Just then, a group of young children ran into the living room, drawn by the noise. There were 5 of them, 2 boys and 3 girls. The oldest boy looked just like his dad and was 6 now, having been just 2 when I last visited. His brother was 3.5, I learned. I shook hands with them like they were adults, which they seemed to find funny. The smallest girl was Melissa's youngest, her daughter Jeanette, who still had her thumb in her mouth, despite Melissa trying to get her to stop. The other 2 girls were identical twins, bright and cheerful. Melissa called them over, and I knelt down to their height. "Girls, this is Ron. He's the Uncle Ron to Jeanette, Ben, and Cal Jr. Ron, these are Cassandra and Courtney. We're watching them while their mom is at work." I noticed a little shake in Melissa's voice, but chose not to mention it. I shook hands with each of the little girls. "Oh my, you 2 are absolutely adorable," I said, gently placing my hand on the head of the girl on the left. "Cassandra, right?" I asked. She nodded eagerly. "Do you like it when I call you Cassandra, or do you prefer Cassie?" "Cassie," she answered sweetly. I grinned back at her. "Then Cassie it is," I replied. I turned to the girl on my right. "And that must mean you're Courtney, right?" She nodded with excitement. I settled back on my heels. "Courtney and Cassie, Cassie and Courtney. Those are 2 beautiful names for 2 lovely little girls," I told them. They smiled shyly. "Are you our Uncle Ron, too?" Cassie asked softly. I glanced at Melissa and Cal, noticing a little tension in their posture that I didn't fully understand. "Do you think their mom will be okay with them calling me that while I'm here?" I asked. They looked at each other. "No, I guess that's okay," Melissa said carefully. "We'll need to check with their mom, but it should be fine for now." She seemed a bit on edge, and I made a note to ask her about it later. Turning back to the twins, I smiled. "Then Uncle Ron is perfect for now, okay?" They beamed in response. I looked at them for a moment, feeling a strange sense of connection. "And I know I'm Uncle Ron to this little lady," I said, noticing 16-month-old Jeanette inching closer while I talked with the older girls. I reached out and picked her up, giving her a gentle hug. Once she got over her surprise, she burst into giggles as I playfully tickled her tummy. Suddenly, I wrapped my arm around Cassie and pulled her in for some tickles, which made Courtney jump in to join the fun. Before long, the two boys wanted to be included too. The living room turned into a lively area filled with laughter and happy chaos. I couldn't help but smile as everyone tried to tickle each other, even though I stayed calm. No amount of poking would make me laugh. After a bit, the twins ran off, pretending to be scared, with Jeanette following them. The boys sat on the floor, leaning against the couch to catch their breath. I noticed the girls peeking in from the doorway, but I decided to ignore them. "Whew," I said, taking a deep breath. "That was fun." I couldn't help but grin as both parents looked at me in surprise. They seemed to expect me to say the usual polite greetings and send the kids away. I chuckled at my two best friends. When I stood up, Melissa hugged me tightly. "You had us so worried," she said softly, her voice serious for the first time in a while. "I was afraid you weren't coming home," she added, her eyes a bit watery. "Melissa," I said firmly, "I'm home. I'm fine. And I promise I won't go back there again, okay?" That seemed to ease her worry, but I noticed my shirt pocket was getting a little wet. "It was so hard when we heard you were hurt," she said, her voice shaky. "You're like a brother to me, and I was scared." I held her at arm's length for a moment, feeling a lump in my throat. "Well, I don't have a sister or brother either," I told her, then turned to Cal. "Cal?" He nodded in response. "Is it okay if I call your wife my sister?" I asked, mixing seriousness with playfulness. "Sure, I guess you can," Cal replied with a light sigh. "But if she starts crying again, it's on you, got it?" Melissa stuck out her tongue at him. "So what do you think, Lissa?" I said. "Shall we make it official? Brother and sister forever?" She nodded cautiously, sensing I might be up to something. I stood facing her and took both her hands in mine. "I, Ronald Terrence Masters, take you, Melissa, to care for and tease." Just then, I took off running for the kitchen door and out to the backyard, just as she playfully tried to tag me. None of the kids understood what we adults were talking about. Ben, Melissa and Cal's oldest, looked at me, then at his little sister and the twins, confused about why anyone would choose a sister they didn't already have. That evening, I enjoyed a wonderful home-cooked meal, something I hadn't realized I missed. Melissa smiled brightly when I praised the food, and I meant it from the heart. As I said goodnight and called her sis in a serious way, she returned the gesture by calling me brother. I noticed she was trying not to cry as she shut the door, but even though Cal said it was my duty, he would have to deal with it. A week later, at a small restaurant downtown, I looked over the housing inspector's report for the house I was planning to buy. The roof needed some repairs, and the sellers agreed to lower the price to help with those repairs if I made the deal soon. That worked for me. I had liked the house from the start and couldn't wait to move in. It would be my first two-story home. I signed the paperwork and neatly organized the documents before putting them in my briefcase. "Hello, stranger," a woman said, and suddenly I felt nervous. I looked up to see a tall, pretty brunette standing by my table. I stood up slowly. "Hello, Sherry," I replied. We shared a long look before I shook off the surprise. "Where are my manners?" I said. "Please sit with me." I gestured to the chair beside me. She smiled and sat down gracefully. I didn't remember her being so poised before our divorce, but memories can play tricks on us. My last impression of Sherry wasn't a good one. "Thank you," she replied, and we studied each other for a moment. She smiled. "I wasn't sure you'd be warm or if you would want to avoid me," she said slowly. "Like the last time we spoke." I felt a slight blush creeping up my neck. I owe you an apology for how I spoke to you that day," I admitted quietly, trying to calm my nerves. "No matter what happened, I shouldn't have reacted that way." "That's all right," she replied, her eyes searching mine. I shook my head. "No. I feel embarrassed when I think about how I behaved, Sherry. My parents raised me better than that. My mom would have been disappointed." "Well, that's in the past now, and you did have some big reasons that day, Ron," she said softly, feeling a slight blush herself at the memory. "Like you said," I replied. "That was what, almost 4.5 years ago? No, a little more, right?" She nodded. "It's been almost 5 years since we went our separate ways," I noted carefully. "5 years wiser, do you think?" she asked gently. "I hope so," I said, trying to be as truthful as I could. "Sometimes I don't quite live up to that, but I do my best." "So do I," she replied softly. We continued talking quietly for about 30 minutes until she had to leave to get back to work. I watched her every movement as we spoke. Each moment felt both familiar and new at the same time. Sherry was now 31. She had been just 20 when we first met. As I sat there, I compared the woman before me with the girl I remembered, finding new things to appreciate about her now. She seemed calm and confident, her eyes meeting mine firmly but kindly. Her posture was upright, and she radiated self-assurance. The older Sherry wasn't a traditional beauty, not like a model who was very thin, but she was attractive in her own way. Her bright green eyes were wide set above a nice nose dotted with light freckles. Her lips were full and natural. Her cheekbones were high, giving her a unique look, and there was a spark in her features that brought them to life. When she smiled, it was hard not to smile back. She looked a bit fuller than I remembered. She had once been unsure about her looks, but now she carried herself with newfound confidence. I could see how much she had grown and changed with time, and I admired her journey. Some questions are best left unasked between former spouses. "Well," she said, glancing at her watch, "I need to go or my boss will be upset." I didn't expect to feel so let down by her leaving, so I stood up with her. She paused, then spoke again. "Ron, can we meet somewhere to talk? Just the two of us, without rushing off?" I looked at her for a while. There was a quiet seriousness in her voice. "How about we go out for dinner sometime?" I said on impulse. "We could chat then." Her smile lit up her eyes. "Tomorrow is Friday," she suggested gently. "Maybe a place that's casual?" I replied. "Golden Corral?" she offered. The buffet seemed like a good idea to me, too. She jotted down her phone number on a napkin and tucked it into my shirt pocket. She said she would always have her phone close by. As she leaned down to write, I recognized her familiar style. She mentioned she would meet me at the new restaurant on the Loop, but wouldn't arrive until after 8 p.m. I told her I would be there. As Sherry walked away, I noticed she still had the same slim ankles and nicely shaped legs I had admired before. I remembered how gracefully she moved. She paused at the door, looked back, and smiled warmly at me. That evening and much of the next day, I spent time reflecting on things. I was still on leave from work and hadn't gone into my new office except to let them know I was around. A week from Monday would be my first day at work. I had quickly found a house and taken care of all the important things needed for moving far away. This left me with a lot of time to think. Seeing Sherry again after so long was a surprise. I thought I would see her around town eventually, but her sudden appearance caught me off guard. I hadn't prepared myself for how I would feel about her. It had been a little more than 4 years since our divorce, and about 4.5 years since we separated. It had been a long time since I had seen her. I didn't go to the last court hearing, and my lawyer told me she hadn't gone either. We had not crossed paths for years. I was surprised to find that she still made my heart race. I could still remember the bond we shared. That was never unclear. I could picture the moments we had together clearly. For a long time, I had kept pictures I took that night, but I had thrown them away when I left for my deployment. I felt relief when I saw those pictures turned into scraps at the bottom of the shredder. But when I tried to reach for the anger I felt when I first learned about Sherry's choices, I found I could only remember the feelings, not feel them anymore. I was surprised by this. I wondered why the pain was gone, but I couldn't find a reason that made sense to me. I knew the saying that time heals all wounds, but I wasn't satisfied with that. There had to be more to it, but I didn't know what. I had been at the restaurant for 20 minutes when Sherry arrived. I tried to hold off a little longer, wanting to keep her waiting instead of the other way around. I hoped that would give me an edge for our conversation. However, I couldn't wait at home any longer either. When she drove in and parked nearby, she saw me in my SUV. As she hurried over and apologized for being late, I had to admit she was right on time, so no apology was needed. My plan to have an advantage in our talk quickly faded away. We talked for a long time after the waitress brought our food, steak for me and a different order for her. We discussed my promotion. She smiled and gently patted my hand to congratulate me. She wanted to hear all about my trip to Afghanistan and the difficulties I faced. She listened closely, rarely taking her eyes off my face. I found it hard to focus on my words sometimes. I didn't remember her showing that kind of interest when we were together before. I felt really happy and warmed by her attention. There was a moment when I touched my left shoulder to point out the one that had been hurt. She left her seat at the table and moved closer to me. She asked to see the scar, and I couldn't say no. I unbuttoned my shirt a little and pulled the collar back to show the small mark that was left. She gently touched it with her fingers and looked at me. I could hardly hold back my emotions. I'm not sure what she would have done next, but she sat back down before I got too overwhelmed. Melissa's diary. I was surprised. I don't know how she did it, but Sherry managed to reconnect with my brother just a few days after he got to town. She says it was just a chance meeting at a cafeteria where he was having lunch, and I'm not sure how she would have known he was there, so I guess I'll trust her for now. I'll never understand how she convinced him to go out with her the next night. Wow, she works fast. She said they went to a bright and open restaurant, so neither of them felt pressured. She mentioned they talked for a long time, and Ron let her share everything she had prepared to say over the last 2 years. She told him she regretted her past choices and felt bad about what she did. She made it clear to Ron that there was no excuse for her behavior and that she wasn't trying to justify it. Ron, bless his heart, didn't rush her or interrupt. Sometimes he really does the right thing. After she apologized for hurting him and for being dishonest, Ron smiled and told her it was hard to stay mad at someone who was honest about their mistakes. He said that between what they both went through, the anger and hurt had faded. He hoped she felt the same way. Sherry told him she hadn't felt bitter about anything except her own actions, and Ron encouraged her to move on, saying it was as if those things had happened to different people. Sherry saw this as a sign they could start fresh. I wonder when she'll tell him about her 2 roommates. It seems important for him to know about that if they are starting over. Anyway, she said she felt incredibly happy when she got home, as if a huge weight had been taken off her shoulders. I tried to warn her to take it slow, reminding her that he might still remember the hurt from before, but she didn't seem to listen. Then she said she loved him even more than when they first got married, and that made her so happy she cried again. Now I'm feeling emotional too. Cal has told me before not to cry over the keyboard or it could break, so I need to take a moment. I thought I handled that first meeting with Sherry pretty well, all things considered. When she started to talk about her past and how she had hurt me, I got ready for a wave of old feelings, but they didn't come. I told her that all of that was 4.5 years ago, that we had both changed, and I encouraged her to let go of the painful memories. Without thinking, I comforted her by saying that everything had happened in a marriage that was now over. I mentioned that the divorce had closed a chapter on most of the pain. What surprised me was that I realized halfway through my words that I actually believed this. The happiness on her face was clear and infectious. Over the next month, Sherry and I met a few times to talk. Usually we went to a restaurant like we did the first time, but sometimes we took a long lunch and went to a park. Each time we talked about the things that led to our divorce, and while comfortable might not be the right word, we got used to discussing it without any lingering anger. I started to worry that our calm discussions were giving a sense of closure I didn't truly feel. One evening at Denny's, we talked about how I might have accepted the past, but I could never forget it. I told her that while I was ready to move toward forgiving her, it shouldn't erase her responsibility for what happened. To my surprise, Sherry readily accepted this. She said she couldn't blame anyone but herself and would have to live with that forever. She reached into her purse and pulled out a picture from that night. It was a bit worn out, but it was still mostly intact. Well, there wasn't much I could say. She seemed to understand where our talk was headed before I did, and I didn't need to convince her of anything. In many ways, she had gone further than I expected. It felt strange, but neither of us seemed upset by our talk. It felt necessary, and when it was over, we could move forward. Once we got past that, we spent the rest of the evening discussing other topics, leaving our troubled past behind. I asked her about her job and how she felt managing a large team of analysts, and her face lit up with excitement. She really enjoyed talking about her work and the people she worked with. By the time we left Denny's, I felt like I knew most of her coworkers and their families. I tipped our waitress $20 for being so patient with us all night. I'm sure we had more than covered that with our coffee. So you're going to be 4 next month, and so is your sister? Wow, I said. I was talking to Cassie, who stood by my right knee while her sister Courtney sat on my lap. Courtney was quiet, snuggling against me with her eyes closed. She seemed really tired. Both girls wore matching pink shorts, white shirts with little cartoon characters, and white sandals. "We're twins, silly," Cassie said with a giggle. "We always celebrate our birthdays at the same time." I acted surprised and encouraged her to tell me what she wanted for her birthday and other fun things. Courtney woke up just enough to shift and sit more comfortably beside me, making room for her sister. Soon, both cheerful girls were chatting with me. I was impressed at how grown up they sounded. Since I was speaking normally, they copied my words perfectly. It was quite interesting. Melissa and Cal often took care of the girls, so they were usually around when I visited my sister and her family. Although I hadn't met their parents yet, I planned to ask if I could buy the girls a gift. Maybe Melissa could share my request with their mom. I felt a strong connection with the girls. They quickly began calling me Uncle Ron, just like Melissa's kids did. They would compete for my attention with each other and with Melissa's children. It was very rewarding and warmed my heart. I thought about how women talk about a biological clock. I wondered if I was feeling something similar. After setting the girls down and pointing to the other kids, who were looking at something interesting in the corner of the yard, I walked over to Cal, who was grilling steaks for the adults and hot dogs for the kids. I always enjoyed the barbecues at Cal and Melissa's, especially today. "Cute kids, huh?" he said, nodding at the twins, who were now with the other children, exploring something near the back fence. "Oh, they are sweet," I said with enthusiasm. "Where are their mom and dad? I haven't met them yet. I come here often enough that I should have seen them by now." "Well, their mom is divorced," Cal said carefully, likely thinking divorce might be a tough topic for me. "And she's really busy," he added. I thought. "Do you think she'd mind if I bought the girls something for their birthday next month?" I asked. "I wouldn't want to intrude, but I'd love to get them a little gift." Cal looked at me thoughtfully. "Maybe you can ask her yourself someday," he suggested. Just then his hand jumped a bit when Melissa came up behind him and playfully pinched his arm. "Hey," he said, "what if I'd been flipping something on the grill?" Melissa just laughed. "I looked first," she said with a smile. "Now you stop bothering my big brother, okay?" Cal mumbled before going back to cooking. "Don't worry about him," Melissa said, wrapping her arm around me. "I'll speak to the girls' mom and see if we can give them something, all right?" I nodded in agreement. I was looking down the side of the house when I heard a car drive by. Melissa noticed me looking. "Oh, I forgot to tell you," she said. "Sherry called and said she had a really bad headache and couldn't join us today. She's staying home, but she said you could call her if you want." I felt a bit let down. Melissa had been friends with Sherry long before I met her, and I hoped she would come to the barbecue. "I might do that later," I replied to Melissa. I was starting to see a pattern in how Sherry acted. What she told Melissa made it sound like she'd be home all evening, leaving the door open for me to call and check on her. I didn't know why she felt the need to let me know that. It wasn't like I had a right to ask about where she was or what she was doing, but it did make me feel a bit better. I just wished she didn't have a headache. Melissa's diary. I couldn't be happier for Ron and Sherry. They've been seeing each other for about a month and a half. From what I've heard, they are both loving every moment. They aren't quite admitting to themselves that they are dating, but that's really what's happening. I hear both their sides, and it seems like they want to move past any confusion, but neither knows if the other is ready for that. I'm bursting with the secrets I have, and I wish I could tell each of them how the other feels, but Cal would stop me if I tried to interfere. I spoke to Connie the other day, and she said she and Tom were surprised that Ron and Sherry seemed to be reconnecting. I really don't get it. They have such a history together. Sherry was my roommate then, and I know she dreamed of being Mrs. Sherry Masters shortly after they met. She couldn't eat or sleep until he asked her out. But I'm not sure how long this will last. There's something special pushing them together, and soon they'll really get to know each other. Sherry has to think about her roommates, though. Things will change when Ron finds out. I feel a bit nervous. Ouch. Cal just playfully nudged me and told me not to meddle. Anyway, he wants to go upstairs since the kids are over at the neighbors. Talk to you later. A couple of weeks later, I got back early from a short trip to Denver. I had met with the leader of the returning team from Afghanistan and received updates on the contract and attended a meeting with the corporate leaders. It was the last job I needed to finish as the Deputy Assistant Director of Western Operations. It felt good to be done because managing 2 different challenges had been tiring. We finished the contract a week early. The Army Corps of Engineers checked the road and said it was good to go. We learned a lot during the work, and next time we teamed up with Halliburton, we would be more ready. We planned to write new guidelines for safety and organization for future projects. When we wrapped up late Friday afternoon, the CEO suggested I take one of the corporate jets to fly home instead of waiting until the next day. He said I should take the weekend off. I gladly took the offer and got home about 18 hours earlier than I thought I would. It was dark, but still early in the evening. I figured flying on a private jet was much nicer than dealing with commercial flights. I felt fresh and relaxed instead of stressed and tired. I tried to call Melissa and Cal to let them know I was back, but the babysitter answered and wouldn't give me their numbers. I made a note to ask for them next time I saw them. I then decided to head to Fisher's, where I knew Melissa and Cal were spending the evening. I would miss dinner, but I could still join them for the fun and enjoy the music. I had many good memories at Fisher's over the years. I changed into a fresh shirt and tie and took a few minutes to switch my suit. I called Sherry to see if she wanted to come with me, but she wasn't home, and that made me a little disappointed. When I got to Fisher's, it was packed. The parking lot was full, and a large crowd filled the inside. I made my way through the main door, paid the cover charge, and stepped inside. I had no idea where Cal and Melissa might be, and with so many people there that night, it could take some time to find them. I found a small spot near one of the bars and ordered a soda to stay refreshed while I looked for them. A few minutes later, I saw them at a table near the dance floor. Melissa loved to dance, and I guessed she had persuaded Cal to join her, enjoying the lively atmosphere. I stopped and moved closer to a potted plant near the wall, partly hidden from their view. I noticed Sherry dancing, which made me pause. She finished dancing with an older gentleman, took a seat next to Melissa, and the man gave a polite nod before walking away to his wife at a nearby booth. Sherry wore a beautiful black dress that came just above her knees, with layers that floated softly. The dress she wore was simple, with wide straps that highlighted her elegant shape. I couldn't help but stare at her for a while, feeling a mix of happy memories and foolishness. It was clear that Sherry was alone, and several men came up to her, hoping to spend time with her. She danced with some to lively songs, but politely turned down the slower ones. Some men looked a bit annoyed, but she stood firm in her choices. Only a few older men, including a retired doctor and family friend, were able to dance with her. Sherry absent-mindedly played with an empty wine glass in her hand, choosing not to get a refill when the waitress passed by. What I saw confirmed everything Melissa had been hinting at. She had mentioned that Sherry hadn't been dating since our split and was proud of her independence, staying away from questionable situations. Melissa was right on the mark. I felt a warm sense of appreciation as these thoughts settled in. Then, I suddenly realized that while I had moved past the hurt from our past, I hadn't truly thought about the idea of trusting her again. Surprisingly, I found myself wanting to be open to that trust. Sherry seemed to be living her life thoughtfully, making careful choices. It looked like she was trying to show me she could be trusted again, or at least give me a reason to start believing in her. In that moment, I understood that I really wanted to trust her. I also knew I wanted to let her know how I felt, so I focused on that and pushed aside any other thoughts. I placed my empty glass on a tray with many others, took a deep breath, and walked around a potted plant toward Sherry. Just as I got close, Melissa noticed me from the dance floor. She had been dancing with Cal but stopped suddenly, almost bumping into a couple on their way past. Melissa gasped in surprise as she watched me, and Cal looked around to see what was happening. I could see a smile appear on his face. It seemed Melissa was already getting emotional, and Cal was hurriedly pulling out a large handkerchief to give to her. As I walked closer, I neared Sherry's table. The angle was such that Sherry thought Melissa was looking at her instead. I noticed her tilting her head, trying to understand why Melissa was staring. I approached Sherry, who still hadn't seen me. "I was wondering if you'd like to dance," I said, making sure she could hear me over the music. She initially shook her head as it was a slow song. Then she turned her head quickly, surprised to see me. Startled, she knocked the wine glass from her hand and it nearly fell. I managed to catch it just in time and set it safely back on the table. She looked up at me for a long time, surprised that I was there and had asked her to dance. Finally, her eyes brightened and she nodded yes. I took her hand as she stood up and led her to the dance floor. In no time, she was in my arms. It felt wonderful. Sherry was a lovely woman, though not striking without some makeup. With a little touch, she was beautiful to me. Her brown hair fell softly to her shoulders, moving gently as we swayed. Her dark eyes stayed on mine as we danced slowly together. Without thinking too much, I leaned in and brushed my lips against hers. It was the first time I had held Sherry since our divorce, and the first time we'd shared a moment like this. But it felt so right, like this moment had been coming for a long time. "I've never met anyone who takes my breath away like you do," I told her quietly. She smiled, tears starting to form in her eyes. "Don't cry," I said. "There's no reason to cry." At that moment, we gently bumped into Cal and Melissa. Sherry left me to hug Melissa, and they both started to get emotional. "We have to go to the ladies' room," Melissa said, trying to hold back tears. The two women hurried across the floor, leaving Cal looking at me with an understanding smile. We both shrugged. "Well, I'm not dancing anymore," he said. "Let's go back to the table before someone takes it, and maybe we can grab a drink." I decided to follow his idea, and we soon found something to sip on to ease our dry throats. When the night was over, I took Sherry back to Melissa and Cal's house since her car was parked there. It was too late for her to be driving around. The only other people out at this hour might be up to no good. We sat in my SUV for a while before she went inside. We chatted, but it was light-hearted, not serious. We held hands, like two young people on a first date, and I didn't mind that at all. After some time, we fell quiet, sharing a gentle moment that spoke volumes. When Cal and Melissa returned, they had stopped for milk on the way, I walked Sherry to the front door and said goodnight. I didn't want the evening to end, but I sensed Sherry wanted to take a breath and think about what had happened. I felt that way too, in a way. In truth, I didn't have much to think about. I welcomed the new, or rather renewed, closeness between us, and it seemed she did too. Over the next few weeks, I took Sherry out to dinner or to see a movie several times. I would have done it even more. But we both had busy jobs and needed our rest. That made it hard for us to go out during the work week. Still, we found time for a few outings. On our second Wednesday together, I told Sherry that I cared for her deeply for the first time in over 4 years. She softly said she felt the same way. We spent the next half hour enjoying each other's presence. If we had more time to explore our new bond, we might have kept talking, but life got in the way. The hour was late, and we had work in the morning. As days went by, we became more comfortable sharing our feelings and started using little affectionate phrases and gestures we had used before. I began to see the wisdom in Karen ending our relationship. A few months earlier, I had no idea, but she had noticed something I missed. She knew that I couldn't let go of the feelings for Sherry that I had kept hidden for so long. I could have pushed those feelings aside forever. I understood that, and I think Karen did too. But hiding those feelings took something away from my relationship with Karen, and she sensed it. I now realized I had hesitated when trying to open up to her. She was smart enough to see it would always be like that. I admired her for not accepting it. I told her this during a phone call the next evening. She laughed and thanked me for what I said, but she hadn't thought it through. It was more instinctive for her. I thanked her again. After a brief pause, she asked how things were with Sherry. I was ready for the question and shared my deep feelings for her. I mentioned how sharp Karen's instincts were, and she laughed. Even though I was a bit shy about discussing Sherry, Karen shared that there was a new man in her life. I knew him slightly. He had visited me a few times as part of the International Red Cross at the Kabul hospital. He was from Sweden and seemed very interested in America. It looked like he and Karen had talked about my situation several times, and he had become interested in her. After a moment, Karen told me that while I was under anesthesia in the operating room, I had called out for Sherry. The Red Cross observer had thought she was Sherry for quite some time. I was quiet for a while. I didn't know how to apologize for that, so I told her. She said it wasn't necessary. She had already suspected how I felt about Sherry, which only confirmed her thoughts. One day, she told me that when a Red Cross worker visited the United States on a trip sponsored by the UN, he found her name in the phone book and called her. They had gone out a few times before, and she said she really liked him. She hoped I would like him too. I searched my feelings for any jealousy, even though I knew it wouldn't make sense, but I found none. I told her I wished her all the happiness in the world, and I truly meant it. She thanked me and wished the same for me, asking if we could stay friends. I simply replied, forever. After that, we got off the phone, both feeling much lighter. I picked Sherry up for a few official dates, but I never got to see her apartment. She would say her roommates had made a mess of the living room or come up with some other excuse. I mentioned wanting to meet her roommates, and she promised I would soon. She seemed to be hiding something, but it didn't seem harmful. It felt like something she just wasn't ready to share, and I respected that. Besides, I thought if one or both of her roommates were guys, I would know by now, and she would seem more nervous about it. Since she didn't seem nervous, I figured they weren't a threat to me. Still, I wondered. On a Friday night, 3 weeks after our first dance since the divorce, I picked her up and we went to a nice restaurant in town. The place had a theme from old 19th century San Francisco. They even had a swing hanging from the ceiling, and sometimes a performer dressed as a saloon girl would climb up and swing above the audience. I noticed her beauty, and I took a moment to tell Sherry that her grace outshone the performer. She blushed, and I could see her mood lift whenever the performer took a turn. This made her even more lovely in my eyes. After dinner, we went to see a late movie, but I don't think either of us really watched it. I held her hand, and her head rested on my shoulder as we enjoyed quiet moments together. Honestly, I couldn't remember anything about the movie once it ended and we stepped out into the warm Texas night. We hadn't made any further plans, and I felt a strange mix of excitement and uncertainty, excited about the chance to get closer, yet unsure about taking that next step. She paused by the passenger door of my SUV, leaning against it and drawing me close for a gentle embrace. We held on to that warmth of connection. I rested my hands lightly on her shoulders and back, feeling a wave of affection wash over me. When we finally let go of our hug, we took a moment to breathe before I opened her door and helped her get in the car. I started the engine and turned on the headlights. I paused for a moment before shifting gears. When I looked at Sherry, she leaned in for another warm hug, her excitement clear. "Where do we go from here?" I asked softly when we pulled apart a bit. She smiled and gently touched my hand. "Ron," she whispered, "you're driving. You can take us wherever you want." I felt confident in that. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, wanting to make sure we were both on the same page. She smiled at me reassuringly and gave my hand a gentle pat. "I'm sure," she said with confidence. I put the SUV into gear and joined the nighttime traffic, feeling clear about the road ahead. When we got to my house, we shared a warm moment at the front door, feeling our connection growing. Sherry asked if she could have something to drink. I took her hand and led her to the kitchen where I had some wine coolers in the fridge, the kind she liked. She smiled brightly as she took one and enjoyed a refreshing sip. I showed her around my new home, highlighting its cozy features that I loved. She especially liked the fireplace. "That's so beautiful," she said. "It's just like the one I've always wanted." I admired the rock-lined fireplace, the wooden mantel, and the wide space in front of it. It matched the dreams she had shared with me during our past talks about a home. Although we couldn't have it back then, I had now found a place that made those dreams a reality, thanks to the lessons I learned from Karen during our marriage. When I suggested taking Sherry upstairs to my bedroom, I felt a little nervous, and I noticed she seemed a bit hesitant too. We both knew this step was important, and it felt somewhat intimidating. Still, she followed me up the wide staircase with a spark of curiosity. As we reached my bedroom, she noticed the open door to the spacious bathroom, a feature that had drawn me to the house too. She walked in and briefly closed the door with a soft comment. I was surprised when I heard the sound of water running shortly after. The door opened a little, and she invited me to join her. This was unexpected. I remembered how rare it had been for her to want to share these moments with me during the past year. I quickly placed my coat aside and stepped through the bathroom door. Sherry had her back to me, but turned slightly with a warm smile. "I have a surprise for you," she said, her eyes shining playfully. "But first, could you help me feel refreshed?" That sounded exciting. I washed my hands and started on her shoulders, gently rubbing in some soap. "Honey," Sherry said softly, "could you help me clean everywhere, please?" I sensed she was feeling a mix of emotions as she spoke. She handed me the shampoo bottle over her shoulder. "Are you sure this shampoo is okay?" I asked, wanting to make sure it was right for her. "I just grabbed a regular brand from the store," she replied with a nod. "That sounds fine," I said. I guided her under the water to wet her hair. She turned to face me with her eyes closed, and I chuckled, remembering how she looked like a fairy when her hair was wet. She leaned back and smiled, keeping her eyes shut. I poured some shampoo into my hands and worked it into her thick hair. As I did this, I wondered why we were showering together. We had both been clean earlier, and there hadn't been any reason for a shower. Still, I enjoyed sharing this moment in the warm water. "You used to want me to shower with you more," Sherry said quietly. "I wish I'd listened to you more often." "We can enjoy our time now," I replied, rinsing her hair. "Okay," she said with a smile. I put some conditioner in her hair while giving her a gentle scalp massage, rinsing it out after. Sherry seemed relaxed, moving with me and leaning back against me. Once her hair was finished, I washed my hands and started at her neck, gently spreading soap where I could reach. I even washed her ears, expecting her to react, but she stayed still and seemed to appreciate the care. As I moved my hands over her skin, I enjoyed the reconnection we were having after so long. I continued down her back and sides, noticing how she was soft and graceful. Kneeling behind her, I gently encouraged her to spread her legs a little and saw something that caught my attention. "Wow," I said softly, pausing for a moment. My comment and the stop in my movements brought her back to the moment. "Hey, that is your surprise," she said playfully. "But you have lots to do before you get there, so keep going." She seemed happy, clearly enjoying my attention. I got back to work, eager to show how much I cared. I carefully helped her with the soap, making sure she felt comfortable. "Bend over a little, honey," I said gently. She nodded and did as I asked. Sherry had always been a bit hesitant about some things, but now she seemed ready to trust me in this new situation. I gently applied soap to her back, being careful and kind. After a little while, Sherry shifted and leaned against the shower wall, allowing me to continue. I made sure she was comfortable. We both took a deep breath as I kept going, paying attention to how she felt. When she didn't show any signs of discomfort, I carried on, trying to keep things relaxed. "That's number 2, she suddenly said, letting out a sigh. I was a bit surprised, but quickly understood she was thinking about how our relationship had changed. "What do you mean?" I asked. "That's the second thing I wish we had at least tried before," she explained, "if I hadn't been so uptight and distant." I gently interrupted her, not wanting her to get stuck in past regrets. "Well," I said, stretching the word playfully, "as I said before, we can make up for lost time if you're willing." Sherry had been moving a bit, but now she relaxed, looking happy. "Count on it," she said confidently. "We're going to do a lot of things we should have done a long time ago," she added, her voice full of excitement for the future. I carefully washed my hands. I focused on washing her face next. She closed her eyes and tilted her face up towards me, showing that she trusted me. The warm water had nearly washed away all her makeup, and the soap finished the job. Soon her face looked clean and bright. I noticed the light freckles on her nose and the soft curves of her face. I brushed my fingers gently against her lips, and she stayed still, not pulling away. I rinsed her face off, feeling a strong bond between us. Sherry opened her mouth slightly, clearly relaxed. I carefully applied a little soap to her mouth and helped her rinse it, making sure she was at ease. I moved down her neck and shoulders, then her arms and sides again, all the while thinking about what this moment meant for us. It suddenly struck me that this could be a kind of cleansing ritual, a way to renew ourselves. I washed her chest and lower belly gently, wanting her to feel fresh and clean. Sherry watched me with focus, and I could see she was starting to relax more with each touch. I continued carefully, always making sure she felt comfortable and respected. I looked up to see her watching me with a hint of worry. "Do you like it?" she asked. "Oh, yes," I replied with enthusiasm. I truly appreciated the smoothness and the effort she had made for us. Sherry had always been beautiful, and this was another sign of her care. "But how did you—" "Electrolysis," she replied simply. "Wow!" I exclaimed in surprise. "Why did you do it? How long did it take? Did it hurt?" She looked at me with warmth. "Let me think," she said cheerfully. "Well, I did it for you because I knew you would like it. It took almost 6 months, little by little. Sometimes it did hurt." I took in her words as I knelt in front of her, water flowing around us. I was really impressed by her commitment. "How did you know?" I asked. "I didn't realize until a few months ago that I would come back to town, and you couldn't have guessed we would be together like this. How did you know?" "I did this last year," she replied softly. "I hoped someday we would be together again," she added. I tilted my head, curious. "Or maybe I wished for us to be here so much that it just had to happen," she said, tears shining in her eyes. "I'm really happy," I said simply. I wasn't sure what else to say, but that seemed enough. I kept gently washing her legs and feet, focusing on making her feel clean and comfortable. I could see from her little movements that she appreciated my care. She had already said she needed this, so I tried my best to concentrate. It was a little hard, but I finally finished. I stood up, looking at her and feeling a renewed connection. She moved closer, lifting her arms as if to hug me. I gently stopped her, hoping my earlier feelings still held. "Now you have to help me," I said softly. The sadness in her eyes vanished, and I could see the spark of understanding there. She started to wash me with the same thoughtfulness. I focused on staying calm, enjoying the moment we were sharing. When I opened my eyes, she was close but then stepped back, seeming to notice my unease. "Is this okay?" she asked carefully, watching my expression. "Yes," I replied, trying to keep calm. She paid close attention to my comfort, looking for my reactions. After a while, she finished and smiled brightly at me. "About that," I raised my hand gently to stop her. "Sweetheart," I said, "let's take our time and not think about the past. Does that sound good?" She nodded, understanding. "And don't worry," I added with a smile. "I'll remember everything later." She began to wash me a little faster, and we both relaxed. When she was finally done, we shared a warm moment, hugging and kissing. I couldn't help but admire her as we enjoyed being close. After that, we decided to leave the shower, drying each other off with big, soft towels and sharing another long kiss. We walked back to the bedroom together, turning the lights down to a soft glow. In the room, I gently laid Sherry back and kissed her softly, enjoying the moment. Her smile brought me joy, and tonight she seemed ready for more closeness. "Honey," she urged. "Come here. I need you," she whispered, her voice filled with desire. I took my time, then moved up beside her, feeling our bond grow stronger. She seemed very happy, warmth radiating from her. There was a soft sound as she pulled back, trying to catch her breath. "Stay with me," she whispered. "I need you here. Please." My hands continued to explore gently as I sensed how close she was to feeling joy. It had been a while, and I wanted to make her feel good. "It's important to please me," she said softly. "I want you with me first. Please." I took a moment to steady my breath, thinking about her words and the connection we shared. It felt important to her, as vital as the moments we had spent together before. She wanted me to hold her close, to reaffirm our bond. I felt that longing, too. With my hands supporting me, I shifted slightly to connect with her. I wanted everything to feel right, ensuring our time together was meaningful. In one steady motion, I embraced her fully, feeling our closeness. She responded softly, sharing her affection and asking me to cherish her. I expressed my own feelings, letting her know she was very special to me. Even if she couldn't reply right away, I knew she felt what I meant. We found a rhythm together even after being apart. She moved gracefully, and the energy between us grew. As we flowed together, I felt a build-up within me that was hard to hold back. At the peak of that moment, I felt her warmth, and she held on to me tight, our connection deepening. We were lost in an emotional wave that felt perfectly right. Resting on unsteady arms and knees, I took deep breaths. Sherry did too. The closeness that had held us began to ease, allowing me to adjust and relax. Gradually, our breathing slowed to something calmer. I thought about the deeper connection we had just shared, feeling the need to express my thoughts. "Sherry," I said softly, "you're my partner, and I will always cherish you." She started to tear up, but with happiness. As tears flowed, she pressed gentle kisses on my face and chest wherever she could reach. "I promise, darling, I'll always protect you. I will," she said with emotion. After a while, we embraced again, this time aiming for a lasting connection. We talked softly, sharing kind words and smiles with gentle touches. "Are we moving too quickly?" I asked her, lying beside her and looking into her eyes. She giggled in response. "I don't think so. It's been a long time since we had a moment like this," she said. "Really?" I replied, teasing. "You keep track of that?" She laughed. "Does this mean I need to remember another special day?" "No, sweetie," she smiled. "This moment is the only one you'll need to remember from now on." I smiled back and leaned in for a gentle kiss. "I'll treasure this forever," I promised. We kissed again, and she laughed, pulling back slightly. "Don't you remember our first special moment a few weeks after we met?" she asked playfully, her tone warm. I sighed, thinking back to that time. "Of course," I replied. "And then you moved in with me and helped me clean up," I teased. "Well, some things needed organizing," she replied with a smile. "But your bed was really nice," she added thoughtfully. We both chuckled about those days. "Yeah, we made some great memories," I said. We enjoyed a moment of comfortable silence. "Ron?" she asked quietly. I responded, noticing she was pulling back until our foreheads were no longer touching. "I want to say again how sorry I am for the mistakes I made and how much I regret hurting you. I want to make things right if you give me the chance. Please?" I took my time to respond. She had shared many feelings that night, and I was unsure how to interpret all of them. When I stayed quiet, she continued. "Honey, I love you so much it feels hard to breathe sometimes," she said earnestly. "Please forgive me for my past mistakes. I wouldn't know how to go on without you." She held me close, arms around my neck. "Shh," I whispered softly, gently stroking her shoulders. She seemed lost, but I thought I knew how to help her find her way. "Sherry, my dear," I began gently, "I've needed to tell you something for a while, and I wish I had done it sooner." I took a deep breath. Sherry watched me closely, waiting to hear. "Sweetheart, I forgave you a long time ago. I won't forget what happened, but it's no longer the main thing in my mind. It's just a part of my past." I shifted slightly, feeling a mix of emotions, and she rested her chin on my chest, looking into my eyes. "I know it may seem like a big moment, but when I say, 'I forgive you,' I mean it." The pain I felt faded away at some point. I can't really remember when it happened, but it was gone before I went overseas. Others noticed that you were still in my heart long before that. I paused for a moment, worried that talking about my past might upset her, but when I saw her expression, I felt okay to continue. "I love you, Sherry," I said. "It might sound a bit proud, but I let go of the past before I met you a couple of months ago. After we met, I tried to take things slowly, but my feelings have been strong. Can you accept that?" She nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. "I will show you how much you mean to me," she said, leaning in closer. "But you don't need to try to make it up to me," I replied gently. "What happened in our past was a different time, and we are not those people anymore. If you keep trying to fix things, it might turn into bitterness instead of healing." "I don't want you to feel bad about this, dear. I thought hard about how to express my feelings." Sherry had been working on a project all evening, and I remembered something from earlier. Then it clicked. Not from the delicatessen, but from Denny's, where she mentioned something important. "Sweetheart, where's your purse?" I asked, my voice full of energy, catching her off guard. She blinked, curious about what I was planning. It's downstairs, on the couch, I think," she replied hesitantly. "Great," I answered confidently. I knew what to do next. I moved from my spot and stood beside the bed. "Come on," I said, taking her hand to help her get up. We reached the doorway, but she stopped. "What if someone sees us?" she asked. I laughed, thinking of how the drapes were all closed downstairs. "It's okay," I said with a smile. "Let them see. They'll just have to get used to it." She giggled and loosened her grip on the doorway. "All right," she said. Hand in hand, we walked downstairs. I turned on a lamp, filling the living room with soft light. "Sherry," I said gently, "you still have that picture in your purse that you talked about at Denny's, right?" Her excited expression shifted to worry, as if she was afraid of bringing back difficult memories. I shook my head and smiled at her reassuringly. "Trust me," I said softly. "Just get the picture, please." While she went through her purse, I stepped over to the fireplace, tossed in some fire-starting logs, and lit them with a match from the mantel. The logs caught fire quickly and lit up brightly. I returned to Sherry. She had the photo in her right hand, but seemed momentarily distracted by the dancing flames. "Honey," I said, stepping closer and wrapping my arms around her, "I've forgiven you for a while now, but now, you need to forgive yourself too, okay?" She looked at me, searching for understanding. "Go ahead," I encouraged her, gently letting go of my embrace. "You have to move on from this just like I did. We can't move forward until you're ready to let go of this pain, to a place where it won't hurt us, where it won't hold us back. Do you see?" I took a step back. "You need to make a choice, honey. Throw that picture into the fire and let the pain fade away with it. If you don't, it's going to stand in the way of everything we want to achieve together." She stood there, her worries put aside for a moment. She looked at me closely, her eyes darting around my face as if searching for answers. "Are you sure, Ron?" she said quietly. "You want us to start fresh as if nothing ever happened? That I didn't do something so hurtful that affected you so deeply? Are you really sure about this? Because I'll do what I said. I'll spend my life trying to make it better. That won't bother me. I'll do it willingly." She might have said more, but when she saw me shake my head, she stopped. "No, we can't pretend it never happened," I said slowly. "Neither of us can forget it, but it can remind us of what we must never let happen again. Okay? What you can do is let go of the heavy guilt that I know you're still carrying. Let it go before it drives you away from me, honey." I pulled her close again and kissed her forehead softly. "Sherry," I said gently, "I forgave you a long time ago. It's time for you to forgive yourself, okay?" She opened her eyes and gazed up at me for a moment, still deciding. "I want you to forgive yourself, honey," I said finally. "For us." She tilted her face up and kissed me briefly before walking to the fireplace. She tossed the picture into the flames, watching it for a moment before coming back to me. My arms were already open to embrace her again. She began to cry, letting out all the burdens she had carried for so long. When she woke the next morning, I felt I had my partner back, one who would walk beside me instead of a step behind. Good people can only feel regret for so long before it begins to overwhelm them. Letting go of that heavy self-blame was the final step of the release Sherry started with her cleansing moments. It hadn't been perfect. I'm sure someone could find flaws in our little ceremony. I could only wonder how we managed to get through it so well. In the morning, we took another shower together. We washed each other gently, not as formally as we had the night before. This time felt softer and more peaceful. After a while, Sherry put the soap down and wrapped her arms around me in a comforting hug. When she pulled away, she looked at me with a tired but happy smile. I thought about turning to clean myself, but she held me close. After some time, she took a deep breath but didn't want to let go. She loosened her grip just enough to look into my eyes and smiled playfully. "I have another surprise for you," she said shyly, "if you're interested." I chuckled. "After everything we experienced last night, I wonder what else you could surprise me with." She stuck her tongue out teasingly, but then grew serious. "I have one for when we are alone again, like last night. But there's another surprise that's a bit more complicated." She paused, as if thinking about something, then shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. "I'll share it later, but I hope you'll like it. It's different from this one," she added, her eyes sparkling with mischief. She took my hand gently, looking thoughtful for a moment. She glanced up at me and smiled warmly, a sign of reassurance. "I've been thinking a lot," she said quietly. "There are things I want us to try, but I might not do them perfectly. So please don't be upset if it doesn't go as planned, okay?" I nodded, valuing her openness. We sank deeper into our moment together, feeling more connected than ever. Sherry was sharing parts of herself she hadn't before, making it feel like a fresh start for us. A little later, she focused intently, fully absorbed in what she was doing. The sight of her concentration made me feel overwhelmed with emotion. "Sherry," I managed to say, "I'm almost there." She looked up, her eyes shining with understanding. My body felt tense, my muscles tightening as I held on. As the moment grew closer, a strong feeling hit me, and I couldn't hold back any longer. She noticed and adjusted, being gentle in her response. I could only see her hair as I reacted instinctively, losing myself in the depth of the moment. When it was over, she stood up and wrapped her arms around me, giving me a sense of comfort and warmth. I kissed the top of her head and gently brought her lips to mine, sharing a deep kiss that made us both feel content. "I had forgotten how close we are," she said quietly. I smiled, cherishing the moment. "It always feels balanced to me," I replied with a light laugh, sensing the bond between us. "I think we really fit together," she said happily. I couldn't help but agree. After a while, we needed to take a break. "You know," I said carefully, "you really don't have to do that for me. I appreciate it, but it's not needed." She leaned in to give me a quick kiss. "I know," she replied softly, "but I wanted to show I care." What could I do? I pulled her in for another warm moment together. "Was it okay?" she asked timidly. "Was that my first try?" I laughed lightly. "It was much better than okay," I said with enthusiasm. "Marianne told me you would like it," Sherry said happily. "And I know I'll get better. It was fun," she added with a hint of surprise. "I forgot some things, but I'm excited to try more with you later, right?" "Oh, for sure," I said happily. "Marianne was right," I added, noticing her worried look. "Did Marianne talk to you about trying new things?" I asked. She nodded, blushing. "And did she mention anything else?" I pried. She blushed more, but her eyes remained steady, so she didn't need to respond. I sighed dramatically. "I'll have to find a way to thank Marianne for all her help," I said thoughtfully. "Do you think sending her a big bunch of roses would work?" After a moment of surprise, Sherry playfully slapped my chest, pretending to be annoyed. "A dozen will be just fine with a sweet card," she said jokingly. We got out fresh towels and dried each other off. It was getting late, and we needed to head to Melissa and Cal's house for a barbecue that started around 1 o'clock. As we walked back into the bedroom, something she had said earlier popped back into my mind. Honey?" I asked, not quite sure how to bring it up. "Did you say you practiced a bit with some bananas and something else?" She was turned away, but I could see her neck getting red. "Yeah," she replied slowly. "You have. A different thing?" I asked. She nodded. "Maybe we should talk about that more?" Her blush deepened, and I couldn't help but smile. "Well, you know that list we talked about last night?" She nodded, giving me a small smile of excitement. "Let's add new things to that list," I suggested. "I want to help you learn more about them," I added. She was still blushing, but seemed ready to talk about it. "Can I watch you? Explore yourself? Sometime?" she asked softly. I was surprised. She was becoming more open, but still seemed shy about some topics. I smiled. "My dear lady, I'd be glad to," I said, pretending to bow. She giggled before getting serious and trying to fix her hair. "My hair is such a mess," she said, frustrated. I laughed. "Last night was your idea, right?" I reminded her. She shot me a quick look, but I kept smiling, and she just couldn't stay upset with me. She was too honest for that. Finally, she laughed, too. "I know, but that doesn't help me with this." She was trying to brush out a big mess of her brown hair. "Honey," I said slowly, I wasn't sure if my ideas would be helpful. "Why don't you put it up in a ponytail or something?" She stopped and thought about it. "I'm not a teenager anymore," she replied thoughtfully. I just shrugged. "It's up to you, darling," I said, looking around for my car keys. "I think it would look nice on you, though," I added casually. She studied me for a moment before starting to pull her hair back into a ponytail, using a clip to keep it all together. It's really nice when someone takes time to style their hair in a way that others like. I walked over and took the brush, starting to help her with her long hair. I wasn't a pro, but I was willing to try. Soon, I found the right way to hold her hair and brush it gently to get out the tangles. After about 10 minutes, Sherry had relaxed completely, her eyes closed. I knew we had places to go, but this moment was nice. Sadly, we had to go to Melissa and Cal's later. I remembered something from the night before. Honey, you mentioned you had a surprise for me that wasn't about us, right? Uh-huh, she said slowly, taking a deep breath. Come sit on the bed with me, she invited, looking a bit worried. My forehead wrinkled in confusion. Just then, a phone started ringing, interrupting us. Do we have to answer that? Sherry asked. I shook my head. The phone rang again. Oh no, she said with a sigh. My eyes widened. Sherry didn't often show frustration. The phone rang a third time. Sherry took a deep breath. I guess you might as well answer it, she said with little enthusiasm. Ah, honey, I replied gently. It's your cell phone. She rolled her eyes, a bit embarrassed, and I watched her take it out of her pocket. Hello? Oh, hi, Melissa, she said with a smile. Yeah, I am. Uh-huh. We're both doing well, thank you. It sounded like the call would take a while, so I started getting my watch and moving my wallet, keys, and other things from the pants I wore last night into the blue jeans I had on today. Then I had an idea. Making sure Sherry wasn't watching, I went to my top drawer and looked for a small box I knew was there. I found it, checked to see everything was okay inside, and put it in my front pocket. I was ready to go. Okay, Sherry said into the phone. We'll be there in a little bit. Bye. Checking up on you? I asked playfully. She nodded. I should have called last night to let them know I wasn't going to be home, but someone kept me busy all night, she said with a smile. I pretended to be offended, but she just teased me back playfully. Are you ready to go? I asked. She was, so we left. We stopped at her apartment so she could change clothes. She said she would grab some jeans at Melissa's house and that it wouldn't take long. She told me not to come inside and not to turn off the engine because the air conditioning would take a while to cool down again. So I waited in the car. She was gone for about 3.5 minutes. I started to feel uneasy about her 2 roommates being a reason for me not to step inside. I wasn't sure how to handle it, but I wouldn't let it go on too long. When Sherry came out, she tossed a small overnight bag in the back seat and hung a pair of jeans and a blouse above the door. I saw her putting some papers in her purse, but she didn't say anything about them. A few minutes into the drive, I was about to ask her about the surprise again when a small Honda zoomed past and cut into my lane ahead. I had to brake hard to avoid an accident with some high school students. Their surprised looks told me they would be more careful from now on. The sudden scare pushed her surprise right out of my mind. As we got closer to Melissa's, Sherry started to fidget. She was checking all the controls on her door and the dashboard. Her hands seemed a bit restless. After adjusting her seat a few times during the 9-mile trip, she looked quite anxious by the time we arrived. I turned to her and noticed her worried face. She swallowed hard. Ron, honey, she said carefully. You know that surprise I've been talking about? I nodded. Well, there are actually 2 surprises for you in the house. She took a deep breath. Great, I said quickly, smiling. Let's go see my surprises. I got out of the SUV, and Sherry got out too. We met on the sidewalk beside the passenger door. Ron, she said suddenly. She grabbed my arm and turned me to look at her. Ron, honey, I want you to understand these surprises are for you, okay? You have to believe me, they're yours. Will you remember that? Sherry really seemed to want to say something important, but I wasn't sure what it was. She wrapped her arms around my neck for a moment, looking for comfort. Honey, I said gently, I believe you, okay? I don't know why you're so upset, but I believe in you. She pulled back and looked at me closely, a small smile starting to brighten her face. I'm acting like a schoolgirl, she said with a light laugh. I get worked up sometimes. I think you're going to enjoy these surprises, knowing you. She stepped back and wiped her eyes gently with a tissue. We walked hand in hand up the pathway to the front door. Melissa met us at the entrance. She had clearly seen us outside through the large window. So, she said after giving us both a hug and a kiss on the cheek, today's the big day, huh? Sherry nodded and glanced at me, a reassuring smile on her face. I felt a bit impatient and left out. Too many people seemed to know what was happening, and it was starting to bother me. Melissa looked into my eyes and then smiled warmly. Melissa called out to the girls with a loud voice that could be heard throughout the neighborhood, a tone only a parent could manage. "Cassie! Courtney! Come in the house!" she called. I was impressed by how loud she was, like when authority was needed. I saw the twin blonde girls sprinting toward the house from the backyard. In just a few moments, they dashed through the kitchen door and into the living room. I grinned at Sherry, thinking how special these little girls were. She seemed a bit anxious, glancing back at me. "Uncle Ronnie!" Courtney shouted excitedly. Cassie's voice followed right after. "Mommy!" she squealed in joy. Both girls zoomed past me without stopping, with Cassie in the lead. I felt a bit let down since they usually wanted a hug when I came over, and I loved giving them one. "Mommy!" Courtney called when she saw her sister and turned back to me. I was a bit confused. Turning, I caught a glimpse of Melissa looking at me intently, which distracted me for a moment. Then, I connected the dots. I turned around to see Cassie in Sherry's arms and Courtney hugging her mother's leg. I found myself speechless, my mouth likely hanging open in surprise. I finally met Sherry's gaze. "Surprise! Daddy!" she whispered. I was taken aback. The shock was unlike anything I had felt before. Slowly, I gathered myself. "Mommy, why did you call Uncle Ron Daddy?" Cassie asked curiously. I looked down at her as she gazed back at me. "Is Uncle Ron your daddy?" she asked Sherry, who was quietly watching me. Her anxiety seemed to fade in front of our daughters. "No, honey," Sherry replied gently. "He's your daddy." Cassie played with a strand of pearls around Sherry's neck, hesitating before looking at her mother with confusion. Sherry nodded. "Really?" she assured her daughter. Cassie turned back to me, twisting in her mother's embrace. "Are you really my daddy?" she asked softly. The innocence of her question made me feel very emotional, and I noticed my eyes getting wet. "I think I must be, sweetheart," I answered softly. Cassie looked at me with surprise. Then she playfully tapped my arm with her little hand. I hadn't even noticed I was reaching out to her. "Where were you?" she asked seriously. I felt tears coming, but I blinked them away. "It's not your daddy's fault, Cassie. He was far away doing important work," Sherry said. "And you shouldn't hit your father, young lady," she added playfully. Cassie looked down for a moment before her gaze returned to me. "I'm sorry," she said sincerely. "That's okay, sweetie," I told her. I knew her question needed an answer, but I would wait until she was older to explain. I felt a gentle tug on my blue jeans. Courtney was reaching up, wanting to be picked up. It touched my heart. I lifted her into my arms, feeling many emotions. "What's wrong?" she asked, worried. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, sweet girl," I replied gently. "You didn't do anything wrong at all." She stared at me for a moment, looking for reassurance. Then she hugged me and started patting my shoulder. "You don't have to be sad, Uncle Daddy," she said in her little voice. She pulled back and quickly covered her mouth with her hands. She giggled. "I called you Uncle Daddy," she said, as if it was the funniest thing ever. I couldn't help but laugh with her and gave her a soft kiss on the cheek. She looked at me with curiosity. "Don't you want to kiss me like Uncle Cal kisses baby Jeannie?" she asked. I nodded. With a big smile, she leaned in to give me a quick kiss. I had to turn away for a moment, feeling a bit overwhelmed before I could face everyone again. "Oh," Courtney said, her eyes shining with excitement. "I gotta go tell Ben and Lil Cal and Jeannie," she declared happily. She started squirming in my arms. "Let me down, Uncle Daddy. Please?" she asked sweetly. I gently set her down, and she ran toward the back of the house. "Ben! Cal! Guess what? Uncle Ronnie is my daddy!" she shouted. Even though she hadn't made it outside yet, we could hear her announcing the news loudly across the big backyard. Cassie, still in her mother's arms, quickly ran after her sister to share the joy with the other kids. A moment later, she hurried back and came to me. "Kiss," she insisted. I knelt down, took her in my arms, and gave her a quick kiss like I had done with her sister. She wiggled free and dashed for the door, happily squealing as she went. I stood up, watching her until she ran outside. Turning back to Sherry, I saw her standing quietly with a small smile. She stepped into my open arms, and we held each other, swaying gently for a moment. "Ron, honey," she said after a while, "I'm sorry for not telling you. Things just kept getting in the way and I couldn't find the right moment. I wanted to, but then the phone would ring or something else would happen. She paused, and I placed my fingers softly on her lips. I then kissed her lightly. "It's okay," I reassured her. "We might talk later about not sharing things, but right now it's fine." She took a deep breath, clearly touched. Then she bent down to pick up her purse that had fallen when Cassie jumped into her arms. "Ron, everything is here," she said quickly. "I had some tests done so you wouldn't think—" I silenced her with another kiss, gently taking the papers from her hands. "You keep these," I told her. "I don't need to see them." Another kiss followed, strengthening our bond in that moment. The sound of someone clearing their throat brought us back to reality. "Hey, Ron," Cal said. "Are you both okay?" I nodded and wrapped my arm around Sherry's waist. "I have 2 daughters, Cal," I said, still a bit amazed. He chuckled. "Yeah, look at that," he said casually. "What do you think about Sherry's little roommates, huh?" He smiled, staring off into space. "I don't know why it surprised anyone. Anyone looking at the 3 of you could tell they were yours." Melissa playfully swatted at him with her left hand while using her right to pull him in for a hug. She had appeared lost in thought the entire time. "Aw, honey," he said gently. "You've been wanting this for months. You don't need to be so upset." As he hugged her tight, he patted her back with one hand, unsure what to do with the spatula in the other. Suddenly I realized Cal was right. The twins had reminded me of someone when I first met them, and now it made sense. Around their eyes and nose, my daughters looked so much like my sister. And now, looking at them, I could see they were also so much like Sherry. How had I missed that? I shook my head, feeling a mix of surprise and joy. "Men," Melissa sighed, "can be so clueless sometimes. After we ate, we played games with the kids, then let them play by themselves while we played cards. Cassie and Courtney came back often just to touch my hand or my face and smile at me, checking to make sure I was still there. When they returned together one time, holding hands, I gathered them both into my arms and sat them on my lap. After sharing warm hugs, I promised them that I would never leave again. When I said, "I promise," they seemed happy and didn't come back as often. They watched me from different spots in the yard, probably thinking about what I would do next. I had a good idea of what I wanted to do next. I felt pretty sure I could make it happen. On that hot afternoon, the kids were resting on their mats for a short nap. While they slept, the 4 adults were talking quietly in the shade of an old pecan tree in the back of the yard. After a while, Cal and Melissa went inside to check on the children, leaving Sherry and me alone for the first time in hours. We shared a long look. "Want to take a walk?" I suggested. She nodded. As she stood up, I pulled her close, feeling her relax. We walked slowly until we reached the shade of a tall cottonwood tree in the back corner of the yard, enjoying the moment. I had my hands on her waist, and her arms were comfortably around my neck. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. She sighed, and I knew she was ready to answer. I had some ideas, but I wanted her to share her reasons. "I almost told you when we spoke just before the divorce," she said. "But later I held back because I was being selfish," she added softly. I was surprised, but it seemed like a day for surprises. I tilted my head but stayed quiet. "I wanted you to come back because you wanted to, not because you felt forced," she explained. I thought about that and nodded. She seemed a bit surprised. "It was like when I was trying to get you to cut up that photo last night," I said. "You were worried that I might blame you or the kids for tying me down with responsibilities, right?" She nodded. "Well," I continued, "being a part-time dad could have been tough. Visits might have come months apart, which wouldn't help them at all. It would have been hard on all of us." I paused, thinking. I guess it was for the best, but I still feel sad about missing out on things. Sometimes we have to accept a smaller hurt to avoid a bigger one. "Is that what you were thinking?" "Something like that," she replied. "Close enough," she added. "But mainly, I wanted you to love me for who I am. If that wasn't possible, then we wouldn't really be a family, and that would hurt the kids the most in the end." "Yeah, I get what you mean, but we need to talk about this more sometime," I told her. "I might feel upset about it later, but for now, I think you were right." She smiled at me warmly. I knew you'd understand, she said. I was going to tell you when they were 4 anyway, she added. I replied, trying to remember the dates. You waited until the last minute, didn't you? Isn't their birthday in 9 days? She nodded. I thought you'd manage as quickly as you did when we first met, she joked. Back then, you had me completely charmed in just 3 weeks. I laughed. We had talked about that last night. Those 3 weeks had felt like a long time back then. You really know me, I whispered, then remembered the reason I came. We haven't talked much about our future, I said, but we should. There are 2 little girls to think about. She smiled warmly. Don't worry, we have plenty of time. I gently interrupted her with a soft gesture. I was learning that it was a quick way to quiet her, and it was fun too. I moved back to reach into my front pocket. She couldn't see me carefully open the small box and take out its contents. Sherry, I said softly, I brought this with me. I was going to ask if you'd take it, but now, with the girls, well, it matters even more. I took her left hand and gently placed the engagement ring I had bought for her so many years ago back on her ring finger. Sherry, my dear, I whispered, will you marry me? She looked at me in disbelief, her face showing deep surprise. Then her eyes filled with tears and she tried to speak but couldn't find the words. Will you? I asked again. She tried once more but was speechless. She nodded firmly. Suddenly she pulled me into a warm hug. Yes, she finally whispered in my ear when we pulled apart to breathe. We shared another sweet moment, walking back to the house. Melissa and Cal had just come outside. Melissa watched us as we walked up to the patio with our arms around each other. She smiled brightly. Melissa was about to say something when Sherry showed her left hand. Melissa shrieked in surprise, making Cal jump and spill some of his drink. He looked up, saw the shine from the ring on Sherry's finger, and instantly understood what had happened. He smiled and gave me a quick thumbs up. Darn it, Lissa, he said, looking at the big wet spot on his pants. If it's not one thing, it's another. But he was still grinning. That evening, I took my fiancé and our 2 daughters home to our new house. The girls were excited to sleep on air mattresses in their new room while we waited to move all of our things. They thought it was the coolest thing ever, at least until about 2 a.m. when a thunderstorm rolled through town. Sherry and I woke up to the sound of 2 little girls crying down the hall. They were scared and confused about where they were. The girls ended up sleeping between Sherry and me for the rest of the night. I spent a good part of the night just watching their sweet faces while they slept. In the morning, we had fun playing games that made us giggle until we finally got out of bed for a late brunch. In the following months, I experienced many father and daughter moments, from dealing with tantrums to getting them to bed on time. We read stories, cuddled, and shared many happy times together. Sherry and I learned to close and lock our bedroom door when we wanted some alone time. Having children around was new for me, and Sherry hadn't had anyone around since our separation, so we were both learning together. Sherry laughed for weeks about how I rushed to cover up the first time we heard little voices getting closer in the hallway. I just thought it wouldn't be right for them to see me like that at their young age. We also made a plan with Melissa and Cal to look after each other's kids so we could have some time to ourselves now and then. Parents need some time alone, too. I wish I could say everything was perfect. But Sherry and I had some things to figure out, and some of it was tough. Sherry found it hard to accept that I had a long relationship with Karen. She knew it was when we were separated or divorced, but it still troubled her. Our deep conversation that first night helped a bit, but it didn't completely calm her feelings about Karen. I struggled to understand her feelings, but I did realize they were important to her. One afternoon, as Sherry and I pulled into the driveway a moment apart, I looked down and saw her in her car. For a brief moment, I remembered seeing her with someone else at a stoplight long ago. I mostly shook it off, but it surprised me how quickly a memory from the past could bring back strong feelings. In the end, we decided to seek counseling to help us better understand our feelings and past experiences. The counselor helped us work through our issues and establish the necessary boundaries. It was a helpful process, even though it took time. We still had a few trust issues to resolve, but we were working on it. Sherry knew it would take a long time for me to trust her fully again, just like I had in our first marriage. But she also knew I was working hard to get there. just like she was trying to show me how sincere she was. Rebuilding trust was tough, and at times it hurt, but we were both committed to making it work. We didn't have any other options. We cared a lot about each other, and our children made our bond even more precious. We put in a lot of effort to get back to a good place together. 7 months after I asked her to marry me again, our 4-year-old twin daughters walked barefoot down the aisle wearing lovely white dresses. They were given the joyful task of spreading rose petals. They did it with great confidence and energy. Courtney, in particular, took it upon herself to make sure that every little space had at least one petal. Sometimes, this meant she had to go back to spots she had already passed to make sure no area was missed. Now and then, Cassie would see a friendly face and proudly say, "My mommy and daddy are getting married." And that's exactly what we were doing. Hey, listeners, if you enjoyed watching this video and want to stay updated with our latest content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss out on what's coming next. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video with Queen Cheating Tales.